Hello and welcome to the Bible Difficulties and Answers podcast. I'm your host, Lance Smith. Today, we explore a verse that looks at the initial creation of man. Is man made like God, or does he become like God? Genesis 3:5 details a famous biblical incident as the serpent, Satan, tempts Eve and subsequently Adam to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Our problem is, if we were made in the image of God, how can we become like God, as this verse states? As usual, I'll present a number of different opinions from my research and conclude with my own thoughts. Show notes will include links to all we discuss. Are you ready to dive in? All right, let's learn together. Genesis 3:5, and we'll be reading from the New Living Translation. And this is where the serpent, Satan, convinced Eve and then Adam to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And I quote, God knows that your eyes will be opened as soon as you eat it, and you will be like God, knowing both good and evil. Close quote. Now we'll go back to the big book of Bible difficulties to help define our problem here. And it says, Genesis 1:27 says, God created man in his own image. But in Genesis 3:22, God says the man has become like one of us, to know good and evil. The former seems to affirm that humans are made like God. The latter appears to assert that he becomes like God. All right. Now, your initial thought may be that this seems like a really minor sticking point. And in some ways, I completely agree. So I think it's helpful to dive into some research first on why this is a problem. Matt Slick, from his October 11th, 2018 article entitled Annihilationism in Genesis 2:17 and In the Day, that's a pretty complicated title. He starts off our research today with the following, and I quote, Genesis 3:5 is where Satan is speaking to Eve. He is trying to get her to disobey God. Now, there's the obvious problem with using the devil as a source of fact. But linguistically, what he is saying is that there is a direct cause and effect relationship. Also, his phrase is exactly identical to God's phrase, which is for in the day that you eat from it. Now, furthermore, when Adam and Eve ate of the fruit, their eyes were opened to good and evil, which we see in verse 6. And it happened right away, that very day. The result was that they were ashamed, close quote. All right, back to me. So something quickly happened here. Adam and Eve immediately understood good and evil, and they were ashamed. This lack of knowledge instantly lets us know that they weren't like God. Also, because they had no knowledge of good and evil, they weren't immediately cautious and on guard from the talking serpent that arrived. But we can't blame this completely on Adam and Eve's naivete. This is reinforced from an article titled, What Happens to Man's Free Will in Heaven? By Brad Houston, April 15, 2011, where he says, and I quote, What if God put his creation in heaven to begin with? He did. And the angels fell, as we see in both Revelation and in Luke. They fell because they became obsessed with their own beauty and power rather than the ultimate power that they were made to know. Likewise, Adam wanted to be like God and decide his own fate. So why couldn't God make man in a way that it would be certain that he would have freedom but not rebel? Such a state of affairs may indeed have been impossible. Again, it would not be possible for man's freedom to be the same as God's. Man has the potential for pride, to look to himself rather than God for fulfillment. As long as that is true, he has the possibility of sinning, close quote. All right, back to me, and sinned they did. And in a tale as old as time, it's the exact same temptation and yielding to sin that happens to us today. J. Warner Wallace, from his September 9th, 2022 article titled, What is the Nature and Strategy of Satan? Says, and I quote, The devil understands that all of us have been wired with a desire to know our purpose and understand our personal value as part of the creation. All of us want to matter. We all want to be valuable and important to somebody. Satan perverts this by tempting us to satisfy this desire through our relationship to people rather than through our relationship to God. He still does this today. How many times have you found yourself more concerned with what people think of you than with what God thinks of you? Close quote. All right. So now that we understand the problem before us, I believe the answer is fairly simple to this question. The issue is while we were made in the image of God, we are not God. Let's go back to the Big Book of Bible Difficulties for the solution, where they compare Genesis 1 and 3 for us. And I quote, the two passages are speaking of two different things. Genesis 1 is speaking about human virtue by creation, while Genesis 3 is referring to what he had by acquisition. The first passage refers to Adam and Eve before the fall, and the last is referring to them after the fall. The former refers to their nature, and the latter to their state. By creation, Adam did not know good and evil. Once he sinned, he knew good and evil. Once those differences are understood, there is no conflict. Close quote. Now, from thebiblesays.com, in a blog post titled Genesis 3, 1 through 5 meaning, I quote, Satan is called a serpent in the New Testament. We see that twice in Revelation, referring back to his basic nature of being a deceiver and an author of destruction. The serpent here appears to be Satan taking the form of a creature and choosing the craftiest of all the creatures through whom to do his work. The fact that God curses the serpent to crawl on its belly would indicate that the serpent likely did not have the appearance of a snake at the time. Satan asks Eve if God really said she shouldn't eat from the tree, and Eve repeats what God commanded her. The serpent then lies to Eve, telling her that God was wrong and that the fruit wouldn't kill her, but would open her eyes and she would become like God, knowing good and evil. In telling this lie, Satan is telling a partial truth, which is the most powerful sort of lie. Adam and Eve's eyes were opened, but in a way that brought death and destruction into the world. Close quote. Now we can start to see a thread here. The innocence of Adam and Eve, when Satan attempts to deceive, are demonstrating that they are not at all like God. A very interesting article titled What We Really Want by Skip Moen, and this is from May 6, 2018, details the following, and he has a much different take on Adam and Eve than I do. And I quote, You will be like God, and this is Genesis 3:5. Translated in this way, the serpent's voice strikes us as the epitome of arrogance, hubris, and folly. Of course we can't be like God. No one can even imagine such a thing. Although we often think of the first couple as uninformed children, I don't think the story will bear that excuse either. The man and the woman are as an adult as we are. They knew the stakes and they knew what they were doing. But it wasn't an attempt to usurp the heavenly throne. No, the verse should be translated with a much more palatable, you will be like gods, plural, a perfectly acceptable idea in the polytheistic cultures of the ancient world. Men did become like gods. Pharaoh was a perfect example. It was possible, at least it seems so, to become like gods. The serpent isn't suggesting a coup, he's just implying that this couple would have the same status as other members of the divine council. The only thing needed is the ability to determine what is good and what is evil, close quote. And finally, as he so often does, Dr. William Lane Craig from his June 3rd, 2020 podcast on the Doctrine of Man, Part 20, The Fall of Man and the Nature of Sin, gives a succinct explanation for this solution. And I quote, There are three characteristics of sin that have been traditionally identified by Christian theologians. The first would be pride. Genesis 3:5 speaks of this. This is the account of the serpent's temptation of Eve. He says to her, For God knows that when you eat of it, that is, of the tree, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Here, you see an appeal to the pride of man. Man is tempted to arrogate to himself the place of God. So one of the characteristics of sin is pride, arrogating to oneself a status that one ought not to have. Close quote. Now back to me. I think we're able to settle this problem pretty convincingly. While we were made in the image of God, we were not made to be like God. Once Adam and Eve succumbed to the temptation and ate of the fruit, their eyes were opened to the knowledge of good and evil. And in that instant, they were like God in that one ability to understand good and evil and the difference between the two. Now, I enjoyed this episode a great deal. We had some really interesting research here as well. Next week, we're going to have a really thought-provoking verse as we look at Genesis 3:8. How could Adam and Eve go from God's presence if God is everywhere? You may reach us at our website, BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers.podbean.com, or you may reach out to me directly at our email address, BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers@gmail.com, with any questions, comments, concerns, fits of righteous indignation, or just to say hi. Also, please like and subscribe to this podcast and write a review and give it a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, or your podcast venue of choice. It really does help get the word out about the most amazing book ever written. Again, I'm Lance Smith. Until next time, I wish you good luck, good health, and God bless. So long, everybody.